Hello, this is Tana from Ancient Jesus Future Faith. This week, we thought we would share with you one of Don's classic teachings called the Great Reteller. It is one of my personal favorites, and this recording is from 2011 at Genesis Church in Toledo. A few notes about this teaching. In it, Don mentions food for thought. For reference, Food for Thought is a food insecurity nonprofit Don started in Toledo, and it's still going strong to this day. Also, Don mentions N.T. Wright and calls him the greatest theologian of our time. While Don still thinks Wright is a great theologian, he has been disappointed by some harmful views Wright has expressed in the years since, so we would offer a warning to anyone seeking out Wright's information. So, anyway, we hope you enjoy this simple but profound message about how God can help us reframe our experiences and recognize our value. Enjoy.
Actually, I want to start out this evening. My name is Don, by the way, in case you don't know. I'm a pastor at New Harvest across the river. And I want to start this evening kind of telling you a little bit about me. I know I've spoken here a few times, and so you know a little bit about me. But I want to start out by kind of giving you a little bit of my journey. And believe me, it'll tie into the passage that we're talking about this evening. But I grew up as a pastor's kid, a PK. And I don't know about you guys, but growing up in a community as a pastor's kid, there was, kind of an assumption about what a pastor's kid would be, like holy terror, spawn of Satan, that type of thing. And it was accurate for me. And so I was the epitome of the pastor's kid, getting in trouble, mischievous, what have you. And when I was a teenager, I decided that I wanted to be a youth camp counselor. And so I went in, I had to get permission from my pastor to do this. I had to get him to sign off on it, and that was my father. And when I went in to ask him, he told me, Don, you have too many things wrong in your life. You can't possibly do this. That was a tough thing. Had any other pastor been behind that table, I would have got a thumbs up. But this was my dad, and he said no. So then I ended up going away from the church for a while. I moved to the beach. Did my thing there, and then came back, met my wife, and started to feel like I wanted to be more involved in the church that I was a part of. And so I kept signing up for things, and they didn't call me back. And I was like, okay, fair enough. So then we moved to Toledo. Okay, I'd grown up on the East Coast. We moved to Toledo, and I decided I was going to go back to school, and I was going to go for coaching volleyball. Bowling Green has a coaching minor, and so I was going to go there. So I go, and I find out that I hate school. I think it's more accurate that school hated me, but, I didn't care for the college experience that I was experiencing, partially because I had been out of school for 8 years, decided to take a full-time class load, work, and play volleyball. That was not the most wise decision. So I left school and started working. And in the midst of working, I felt God calling me into ministry. To which I said, no way. Been down that road. Been down, know what that's like. But finally gave in, left my job, and went to work as an intern in a church in the Toledo area. And I was there for quite some time and just didn't fit. And so that ended roughly. So it worked out okay because someone else from that church was starting something. And so I went with them to be a part of that. And that ended poorly. It ended with me being fired, which is I think I've been fired twice in my life. And so I ended with me being fired, and that was very difficult. And I sat in my basement and I pouted about this. But fortunately, there were a lot of young men and women that had been a part of my life that just started showing up at my house. And so they said, we'll just keep showing up and you'll eventually teach us something. And lo and behold, I never did actually teach them anything. But we started a house church accidentally, and now I'm at New Harvest as a pastor. But in that journey, I thought that God had screwed up. That what was he thinking calling me? And then I thought, well, maybe I misunderstood the call. Maybe I misunderstood. He was actually talking to the person standing next to me. I was overhearing the conversation, perceived it was about me, when in reality it was about the person next to me. So I want you to just kind of have a sense that my journey into ministry has not been tiptoeing through the tulips. It hasn't been this blissful experience that maybe I had dreamt it would be, that someday they would write novels with hair like yours, the guy on the front. Not like yours, Mike. See, Mike made the mistake of coming out here tonight. And the truth is every Sunday morning that Mike teaches or I teach, we usually pick on each other. So this was great fodder. Thank you. I appreciate you driving. You can leave now. I've already heard that sermon. So tonight, the passage that I have to share with you guys about is the road to Emmaus. And we're all probably fairly familiar with this story. And I want to talk to you about it tonight. Now, my typical gear that I get into when having a text is I love to sit down and I love to play in it, kind of like a sandbox. I like to see what I can build, what can I create. And I love to play in the text. But this text this week kind of struck me differently than in the past. And so, unfortunately for you, maybe, I think tonight is going to feel more like preaching than teaching. But I hope that it's affirming. So if you will, turn with me in the text to Luke. We'll be looking at the road to Emmaus. And it's in Luke 24. Beginning with verse 13. Do you guys sit, stand, squat, calisthenics when we read during the passage? Up to me. Would you guys mind standing with me with this? Thanks. Luke 24, beginning with verse 13. That very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they were talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What is this conversation that you are holding with each other as you walk?" And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" And he said to them, "What things?" And they said to him, "Concerning Jesus of Nazareth, the man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things happened. Moreover, some women of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back, saying that they had even seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see." And he said to them, "O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken, was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So they drew near to the village to which they were going. He acted as if he were going farther, but they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is now far spent." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at table with them, he took the bread and blessed and broke it and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures?" And they rose that same hour and returned to Jerusalem. And they found the 11 and those who were with them gathered together, saying, "The Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he was known to them in the breaking of the bread. You may be seated. 2 springs ago, myself and a couple buddies, we got to go out to Wheaton College, and they have a conference every year, and we got to hear N.T. Wright. It was all about N.T. Wright. So if you're familiar with him, that's very exciting. If you're not, it doesn't matter. But N.T. Wright is like someone I hold in really high regard. He's probably our greatest theologian and biblical scholar today. Okay? And that's not just my opinion. That's a fairly largely held view. And N.T. Wright, when you have a conference that's dedicated to people critiquing your work while you sit there and listen to them, that's a pretty big deal. So N.T. Wright is there, and he read from this passage, and he says, it was great. He looked at verse 31, and he says, "And their eyes were open," and he's like, obviously this is referring to the garden. And me and my buddies all looked at each other and were like, yeah, obviously. That's what we got right away from that passage. But the phrase there, "and their eyes were open," is the identical phrase used in the Septuagint. The Septuagint being the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. It's the exact same phrase that's used in the garden scene when they eat from the tree, and it says, "and their eyes were open." And it's this moment of God's creation kind of being recreated, right? If you can imagine, like when we eat from the tree, what God had in mind for his creation changed in that moment. Won't you agree? We're not still living life as though we're in the garden. Things changed. And so in this passage, we have this reminder. Now, the beauty of this is that Jesus is often referred to as the second Adam. And so I think that in this moment, when we hear the language "and their eyes were open," it's kind of this good thing. Unlike the first time we read it, there's this moment of hope that we're getting to see, that maybe there's a new lens to kind of view things through. I want to say that Jesus maybe is going to bring a new interpretation to creation. I want to talk to you about you. I want to talk to you about your life, in that if indeed Jesus is the Messiah, if indeed he is being a part of this new creation, this recreation, does your life still reflect the first garden, the first time the eyes were open, or does your life reflect this moment when their eyes were open because Messiah was there before them? You see, that's a really important question, because I think too often in our journey, we still live life as though it's the first garden has power. Right? We believe that Jesus died, was resurrected, and he brought about change, he brought about redemption, he brought about reconciliation, yet we still live as though it's the first garden. That's a problem. That's a problem for us. See, I think part of it is there's a new book out by Scott McKnight that is very good. I'm about 3/4 of the way through it, so it might end poorly, but so far so good. But in this book, he talks about how the church over time has changed its focus. Instead of a church being about disciples, the church has become about decisions. And so we'll make a decision for Christ, but then we never become disciples of Christ. Do you see the difference? Do you feel the difference? Do you understand the difference? That we might say, yes, indeed, Jesus is Lord, and make that decision, but then we still live as though we're in that first eyes open moment. We're living eyes wide shut, right? Whereas if we become disciples, we're able to start seeing the world differently And we're able to start functioning differently. I want to say that this passage is kind of about something that God seems to do constantly throughout the Hebrew text. Let's begin with, there's tons of examples, but let's begin with Abram and Sarai. Okay, Abraham and Sarah. What do we know about them before their encounter with God? Like their major encounter with God. What do we know about them? Anything? They're old. And what else? There's another very prominent thing. What's that? Barren. So they're old and barren. So what is their hope for descendants? What is their hope for their name being carried on? Zero. Right? But God decides instead to retell their story. And not just in a small way, but in a big way. He decides to say, not only are you old and barren, but you will have more descendants than the stars in the sky. What an absurd statement. It is no wonder that Sarah laughs. Right? I mean, what an absurd idea that God meets this old couple, we'll say hobbling along the way, and moving slowly. Maybe they're at the mall walking. And that was funny. Man, I got to work on my jokes. Okay. Thank you for that. That was nice. But, so here they are, this old couple, they're barren. They have no hope for their name being carried on. And God says, you know what, I'm going to retell your story. What about Joseph? What do we know about Joseph, not Jesus' father, Joseph prior? What do we know of Jacob's son, Joseph? What's that? Favorite son. What else? Favorite son, least like brother. We'll go with that, all right? What else? Okay, chose God's ways over temptation, sold into slavery. So let's combine that. So here is his story, which is he is the favorite son. He's the son that had been being waited for. But he becomes hated. He is sold into slavery. And what does he say when he finally encounters his brothers? What does he say to them? Does he say, I can't stand you, don't like you? What does he say? He said, what's that? Absolutely. What you intended for evil, God made good. God retold Joseph's story. You see what I'm saying? That here is Joseph, thrown, potentially put to death, carried off into slavery, but God retells his story. You think of any other passages in the scriptures like that? Where God retells somebody's story? David. How would you say he retold David's story? And I think there's multiple places within David's story. I mean, even at the beginning of his story where, he's not even thought of. His brothers are fighting, and he ends up being the one to fight Goliath. I mean, there's this retelling. He's not even brought to be potential to be anointed. And there's just always these. Any other stories that you can think of? I mean, isn't this spectacular? Can't you see the scriptures are littered with a God that loves to retell stories? Think about the prodigal son, right? One of my favorite retelling stories. The prodigal son, the son basically says to the dad, let me have my inheritance early. I mean, that's kind of offensive, isn't it? Imagine saying that to a parent. Hey, so you're hanging on a little longer than I'd like. Can I get my cut now? Right? And he goes out and he lives counter, it seems, we would presume, to the way that his household would have him live. But the father waits. And the son finally comes to this place of destitution, of being distraught, of being broken. And remember what he says? He's practicing. Have you ever done this? Like practice what you're going to say to someone? That's what he's doing. I can just picture him in front of the pig trough mirror. And he's like, okay, I've sinned against you and God. I was dead. I could just be a slave in your household. I could be a servant, right? But what happens when he gets there and he tells his dad what he had recited? What does his father say? Anybody remember? He says, no. The story is that you were dead and now you are alive. What an amazing retelling, right? The son is like, I've sinned against you and against God. And the father is like, no. You were dead, but now you are alive. And so there's this beautiful retelling of the story. So what does this have to do with the road to Emmaus? On the road to Emmaus, we have two disciples. Now, one of the things that we need to kind of get through our head, because we don't typically think in disciple mindset, these two people walking would have been deeply, deeply, deeply intimate with Jesus. They would have probably walked away from everything that they had in order to follow him. Think about that, right? I used to read this, and when I'd read two of them, it says, and two of them were walking. And I would kind of like picture them as like, because I don't recognize their names, doesn't really go into any detail about them. So I'm thinking that these are like peripheral characters. But if they were disciples of Jesus, there was a deep connection between them and him. I love the verse where it says, and he says, what is going on? What are you talking about? And it says, and they stood still and were sad. Think about this. These two people who had given up everything, who'd bought in completely that Jesus was indeed the one to come. They believed it. They gave up everything to follow him. He's dead. And you can even hear it almost in their voice when they're like, and it's even 3 days later. You know, the way that we read that is that in ancient Judaism, in ancient times, it believed that the spirit could dwell above the body for up to 3 days, and after 3 days, the spirit would no longer. So that's how you knew someone was dead, was that if they had remained dead for 3 days, instead of putting a bell from the grave, people can ring. You guys all remember that? That's weird stuff. But so they were like, it's even been 3 days. He is dead. Don't you know? Are you the only person that has come to Jerusalem that doesn't know? And so they tell him the story. And what does Jesus do? He retells it, doesn't he? See, it's not that Jesus... See, when I first read this, I'm like, why is Jesus being so coy here? Like, he's like, so what's going on? What you guys talking about, But I think it was because the story that he was hearing was not the right story. I don't think that he was pretending to be oblivious as much as he needed to retell the story. See, they were able to cite everything that had gone wrong. They were able to tell him the historical events that took place leading to this death of this would-be Messiah, a prophet great and mighty in deeds before God. And Jesus is like, wait a second. Let me retell the story. It says he began with Moses and then the prophets. And he told them why things had to go the way they did. Now, I love that part of the passage. I love that Jesus retells their story for them. I love that he then goes in and breaks bread with them and that their eyes are open. It reminds me of, I was trying to think about some examples of this. And the one example that wouldn't let me go was Karate Kid, right? Whether you saw the old one or the new one, it doesn't really matter. But Karate Kid, the young boy, he goes to learn martial arts, whether from Jackie Chan or Mr. Miyagi. And when he goes, he becomes very frustrated, right? Because what does he end up doing? Waxing the car, painting a fence. In the new one, I think he hangs up a coat or something, takes off a coat, hangs it up. And he's frustrated because he's like, I thought I was coming to learn martial arts. And it wasn't until the story got reframed that he understood what was going on. There's lots of movies that do that. It's that fun twist in the plot where you're like, aha. I think that we like those stories because those stories ring true for us. You know, for me, I shared my story. And if I just told you the facts like I did, you would say, well, that's kind of a rough go. And that's what I used to say. But when I allow God to retell my story, I can see the beauty of every step. You know, I think that there's something to it. Think about this. Paul, right, shipwrecked, in prison, beaten. What's he always say? And I couldn't be any happier, right? I mean, either he is loco or he is deeply, deeply embedded in this retelling of a story. You know, I look around the world and there's people that are in situations and in life places that I couldn't comprehend, and yet they live with great joy. Sam has recently just taken over as executive director of Food for Thought. That might be one of the most significant things in my life, was Food for Thought, and knowing and coming to meet all of these people who are homeless, who are destitute, who are broken, but understand a deep and penetrating retelling of their story in God. It's unbelievable. I just saw in the Toledo Streets newspaper, one of the unhoused men of Toledo just got a book published. He has a PhD in theology, and he just had a book published. It's unbelievable. You know why I think people are able to be in those circumstances is because they allow God, they allow their relationship with Christ to retell their story. So, I wonder how many of you guys need your story retold. I mean, life deals us some bad hands. Things are frustrating. Things don't go the way we planned. Maybe there's issues that were unexpected, jobs lost, jobs changed. There are things that begin to weigh us down, that feel like imprisonment, that feel like the beating, feel like being shipwrecked on an island by yourself. I can tell you that's what my experience was going through that process that I shared with you, and I gave you a quick version of my journey. And it's not until we allow Christ to penetrate us in a way that begins to retell our story that we can have healing, that our eyes can be opened again. So earlier when I asked you, are you living in the first garden or are you living in the second garden? It's an important question. Because too many of us don't even realize that God is just waiting to retell the story. We have no idea how much he's just waiting to see us come walking up that road, like the prodigal son. He's just waiting for your first movement so he can run out to you and retell your story. You may be sitting here and life is going good, or it's going okay. And there's still something that needs to be retold to move you from a place of complacency to a place where, think about these two disciples walking. They're leaving Jerusalem. They're going home. And the moment that the story gets retold and their eyes are open, what do? Rise and go back. I don't know about you guys, but I get the impression they went back a lot faster than they were leaving. The one song that Sam did, this is the one we have waited for. Like, that's spot on. It talks about years wasted. I think that's one of the lines. Like, that God can't wait to retell that for you. I truly, truly, deeply believe that there is no such thing as years wasted when the story is retold by God. I could look at many parts of my life and go, I wasted so much time. But if I just let the Creator, the reteller of stories, whisper in my ear, I'll know it to be something better than I ever imagined.